Senator Deakin.
Thank you, Chair. Last Friday, on Friday, we had a number of witnesses that spoke that frankly complemented and overlapped with some of the work that we're talking about this afternoon of your team and Mr. Costin's team. And the reality is, as we continue to listen and meet with many Canadians and listen to a few months of witnesses here, the responses of Canadians feel like they're really embedded in fear. Fear of change, fear of significant change, lack of the unknown, these are all change issues, and the perception that the engagement process, the opportunity to be listened to or to be heard, is done and over and here we go. And I think that part of that is tied to the readiness issue too, what that looks like. So while we continue to frame the well-being of our youth as the #1 priority, and we hear it in this room and we hear it regularly, this message is being missed. And I feel fairly accurate in saying that, or it's not being heard as the driver of everything that we're trying to do. How do we get this right? Because I think that's a critical piece, and all of the other pieces matter, absolutely. But how do we get this messaging? This is our most important priority, understood and comprehended and processed first for Canadians before we work through all the other pieces that will come.
Thank you, Senator. You know, I was in the House yesterday, and a member of our House got up and gave the SL31's little speech they give at the beginning, in which he said that when this new legislation come in, that kids under the age of 18 will be able to legally possess up to 5 grams of cannabis. It's not true. It's not true.
It's not true.
I'm sure that scared a lot of parents. I'm sure when they heard it, it frightened a lot of parents. And I have no, I won't ascribe motive, just the effect. And I think a lot of parents would have been frightened by that. Even more dangerously, a whole bunch of kids were misinformed by that. And it actually puts them in jeopardy. Because in every province and territory, without exception, there'll be legislation put in place that enforces an absolute prohibition on possession, purchase, and consumption of cannabis for people under the age of majority. That's the reality. The police will be able to enforce that prohibition, seize the drug, issue a ticket. There are consequences. Thank God it's not a criminal record, because in my opinion, that's a disproportionate consequence. That's a consequence that causes more harm than good. But we'll be able to enforce that prohibition. And so I don't know what the motive is for saying those things, but I think we need to get back to facts. And share facts with Canadians. And that's ultimately my responsibility and the responsibility of my government. And so we'll continue to work hard on going out to communities and keeping people informed so that they know the facts, not the fear, but the truth. And I think that's really important that we do that, and we have to keep doing that. And because I've gone into communities and I've had people, like really decent people who just care about their kids, and they've been fed this nonsense, quite frankly, and they're really frightened. And frankly, the job I used to have, you know, a lot of people thought I was a law enforcement, but really my job was to keep people safe. And I strongly believe that fear is the greatest enemy of public safety. When people are afraid, they don't use public space, they lock their doors, they put alarms and bars on it, you know, they withdraw from society, they withdraw from each other, they make choices that actually make them less safe. And I think one of our jobs in my old job as a police chief, but also one of our jobs here, is to take the fear out of life and I think you do that by giving them the facts, give them the truth, and from my position, reassure them that we're not going to put their kids in jeopardy, and when someone tells them something that isn't true, you have to stand up and respectfully say that's not true.
Thank you. Before I go to round two, I'm going to put in a question or two. First of all, I'm concerned that there still is too much possible criminalization in the system with C-45 for simple possession, simple personal use, which we now say is a health and not a criminalized, shouldn't be a criminal matter. Since the government, and it got elected on this platform, it was part of its platform that it was going to do this. But since then, there have been thousands of people that have been charged with possession. Now, of course, the law is still in effect, but there's still some discretion, but you wonder about that discretion, particularly when it comes to people that are part of marginalized communities and people in poverty or people, racialized minorities. There's been evidence that we've heard of concern that there has been an over representation in those charges from those groups of people. When the Criminal Lawyers Association was in here, they said, under Bill C-45, an adult who possesses over 30 grams of marijuana in public is a criminal. A youth who possesses more than 5 grams of marijuana is a criminal. An 18-year-old who passes a joint to a 17-year-old friend is a criminal. An adult who grows 5 marijuana plants is a criminal. Maybe a little on the extreme side in terms of those statements. But this whole business of drawing these lines of 30, of 18, of 5 plants, etc., they're not things that we're used to seeing in terms of alcohol, another drug, which has had a profound effect on the population for a long period of time, or tobacco for that matter. So I'm particularly concerned about possession. I think we should be totally decriminalizing possession. And particularly, I'm concerned about any criminalization that may involve youth. And when I talk about youth, I'm not just talking about the legal age limit of 18. I'm talking about the social consideration of what we consider youth, which would be people even into their 20s. Because these people, if they get a criminal record, their lives can be ruined. Difficulty to get jobs, difficulty to be able to do anything productive in life. It just weighs on them terribly. So, what do we do to take out the criminalization in this? To ensure that if there's going to be any penalties, that there are things like tickets or alternate forms of justice that are not going to give them a criminal record.
Thank you, Senator. You raised some interesting things. You know, any statute, any federal statute with a penalty is essentially criminal law. But when the criminal lawyer said that all of those behaviors are criminal, did they also mention that not having a bailer in their boat or not wearing a life jacket is a crime or a criminal offense? Because it is. It's under a federal statute. But we don't give people criminal records for that. And the behaviors that you describe, and most of them, I believe, wouldn't result in a criminal record. They're not offenses that would be fingerprinted for. Most of them will be resolved and dealt with through a ticketing scheme that I understand some of the regulations, the technical amendments that we're bringing forward more clearly define a fine structure for the enforcement of those offenses. And they're not things that result in a criminal record. And so, you know, I think that needs to be clear. I also wanted to, if I may, differentiate between, you know, when you say you wanted things to be decriminalized, it's important to really understand what decriminalization is. Decriminalization maintains a prohibition. But instead of having a criminal penalty, you have a civil penalty. That's essentially what decriminalization is. And in fact, if you look at what we are proposing for enforcing the prohibition for young people in the possession of cannabis by using provincial regulation, exactly as we do with alcohol, that is essentially decriminalization, because the prohibition's maintained, but it's not maintained through criminal sanction, but rather a civil penalty, which is what the province allows for in its ticketing regime. And so it's a far less consequential way of dealing with it. I would also point out that in the criminal law, particularly as it deals with young people, there is a requirement, it's very explicit in the Act, in Bill C-45, that any offense for a young person must be dealt with in accordance with Youth Criminal Justice Act. And the YCGA requires that the police, prosecutors, and the courts deal with that young person in the least consequential way. And I'm paraphrasing and perhaps oversimplifying it, but that's the real requirement. And so, for example, if the police find a young person in possession of any amount of cannabis in any province or territory, they have the ability to deal with that young person in a number of different ways. The least intrusive way would be issuing the provincial ticket. If the circumstances required that it be dealt with in a more consequential way, that would have to be justified by the police under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And so I believe there's great proportionality available in this system, and quite appropriate as well. It does not result in a criminal prosecution. It does not result in a criminal record. It's an offense under the federal statute, and therefore I suppose the criminal lawyers are saying, yes, that would make it a criminal offense. But the reality is the records for that are kept in a very different way and do not result in what would be considered an indictable record that would be available to the police or border security officers ever. That information simply would not be available on CPIC because it's not fingerprinted, it's not loaded up into those information systems.
Thank you. Okay, I have two people on for a second round, and we should try to finish at 1:45. That would put us in sync with the fact we started late because of the fire alarm here. So I have Senator Seidman and Senator Patterson, and I may have one more question to finish off. So Senator Seidman.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Mr. Blair. Talk about facts and making facts evident to Canadians and is really critical, and you're quite right. I completely agree with you. So I'm not sure if you saw a feature on CBC television last week on Colorado and the increase in the illegal market for marijuana in Colorado. And in today's CBC News Bulletin, there is indeed a follow-up to that titled, "Why Colorado's Black Market for Marijuana is Booming 4 Years After Legalization." And in fact, it says that in Colorado in 2014, the government's goal was to regulate and tax a drug that was already widely used and to squeeze out dealers and traffickers in the process. In other words, exactly the rationale we've heard from the government. But in Colorado, and this piece completely relies on the law enforcement agencies in Colorado, law enforcement authorities in the state say legalization has done the exact opposite. And they go on to talk about all the problems of the black market booming, driven by criminal organizations. Marijuana users are deterred by higher dispensary prices, loyal to their longtime dealers. And I'm not going to read the article now, but basically they say, investigators say the illegal trade has flourished because the state laws around growing marijuana were overly generous in the beginning and hard to enforce. In other words, when the genie's out of the bottle, you cannot put it back in. So I'd like to hear how you respond to that.
Yes, ma'am. Happy to, because they shared that experience with us. And their advice to us, which we took, was to be very restrictive, very careful. What they said to us is that there were many unintended consequences of the approach that they took. And for example, they allowed cultivation, unlicensed, unregulated cultivations for hundreds of plants, where we do not allow that. The only cannabis that would be available for sale in this country would be that which would be produced under the strict regulatory conditions overseen and enforced by Health Canada. That's not the approach that Colorado began with. They did not put the same strict regulatory controls advised by our task force and adhered to and agreed to by the provinces and territories in the establishment of their distribution networks. They also were operating in an environment where they were surrounded by states that had not legalized. And so they became the source state for all the states around them for illicit production. And so then their circumstances that they found themselves in and the regulatory approach that they took was one which was extremely problematic. They shared that with us. And I would contrast in many, many significant ways our approach, which is far different. Our approach where the only cannabis that would be allowed for sale is that which is produced under strict regulatory control. And if you go to one of these licensed producers, you will see the extraordinary security requirements, the accountability, the oversight, the governance that is put in place, and the testing. That was not what was established originally in Colorado. We did not replicate their mistakes. They shared them with us. We learned from that, and we've taken a very different approach. And by the way, other states have done that as well. And so if you contrast, for example, the experience in Washington State, which took a much stricter regulatory approach, somewhat more similar to ours. They have not had the same experience with illicit cannabis producers in their jurisdiction. I am also sort of compelled back to, we have a situation today where 100% of cannabis production in this country is illicit. And that's one of the reasons we are retaining, and partly in response to Senator Eccleston's concerns, we are retaining the authorities that the police currently possess to deal with organized crime, to deal with those illegal producers, to deal with those illegal drug traffickers. Their authorities, the offenses, and the penalties are being retained. And so the police can still do their job. And in fact, we're also making significant new investments. And the Public Safety Minister has announced $113 million for both the RCMP and CBSA, for the RCMP to improve their law enforcement capacity to address organized crime issues as it relates to cannabis, and to invest in CBSA so that we may do a better job of upholding the integrity of our borders, because we have responsibilities to other jurisdictions as well. And so it's not just simply strict regulation, but it's significant investment. And I think those things were missing in some of the other jurisdictions that you refer. And I'm very grateful to that jurisdiction for sharing their experience with us, so that we might have learned their lessons and not had to replicate their mistakes. We've learned from their history. I think we're going to do it a very different way.
Patterson.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Blair, you assured us that, in answer to my question about the lack of consultation with Aboriginal people, that you were going to continue the dialogue after the bill is passed. Now, frankly, I don't believe that the Aboriginal people are willing to accept that kind of an approach. The UNDRIP resolution talks about prior informed consent. Prior. Most of the consultation that's taken place has been after the bill was passed. It was introduced. So, two questions. I'm talking about accountability to Parliament. And what I want to know is all the great discussions that you're having and all the great progress that you're making, as you told us, on culturally appropriate treatment programs, culturally sensitive education. If this is all going so well, why would you not commit to coming back to Parliament and giving us a detailed report, more detailed than you've been able to give us in your few minutes here today, on these very significant issues for very vulnerable Aboriginal populations dealing with intergenerational trauma, and then satisfy us that we're ready to implement the legislation?
Senator, I'm only able to respond that we consulted with them prior to the introduction of legislation, and that their feedback to us informed us in the development of the legislation we brought forward. When we had a bill, we've gone back to those communities and we've continued to work with them. Our senior officials at Health Canada and Indigenous Services have been working very closely with those communities. I've gone to many of them myself, and I've assured them that just because I've showed up and sat down with them across the table and we've talked for hours on these issues and I've listened to their concerns, we're not done. We're not just walking away and ticking the box and say we've finished this consultation. We're committed to continuing to work with First Nations and Indigenous leadership on the concerns that they raise. Many of them have told us, for example, that they have a strong interest in being able to exercise their jurisdiction. And we've acknowledged and said we respect that, but they're not yet ready. And so there's ongoing discussions that are taking place and will continue to take place with Indigenous First Nations communities on how that might be put into effect. We've also had discussions with them. Many of them are very interested in what might be available as far as getting involved in the economic opportunities that this new emerging industry presents. And we've told them, you don't have to have all of that decided before the date of implementation. We'll continue to work with you. And so those license applications are under development. We've gone out and hired a navigator to work with Indigenous communities. And for those who are interested, and not all are, we've said, we're going to work with you and continue to work with you. And so I think that commitment to continuous engagement, respectful dialogue, nation-to-nation discussion on all of these issues is very much a part of what we have begun with and continued with and will continue with in the implementation of this act and other things that, the government has many bills. And you alluded yourself, sir, and you and I have had a number of, I think, really important and meaningful to me, concerns and discussions around addictions and mental health services in the far north. And we are committed to continuing to work with those communities and with you to address those, not just in the context of this bill, but in the context of the reality that the people living in those communities are facing.
Well, thank you.
Now, colleagues, I have two more people down on the list. And this, if you take into consideration the fire alarm delay, is the allotted hour and a half. Now, if we go much farther, we're going to continue to delay getting into clause by clause, which could be a very lengthy process this afternoon. So do you prefer to keep going with questions, or do you want me to stop the meeting now and take the break and then brief with clause?
Correction of the record.
Pardon?
A quick correction of the record, please, Chair.
All right. Yeah, okay, it's a point of order, I guess.
It is a point of order. There was a statement made earlier about the CBC story about the record with diversion of legal and illegal cannabis in Colorado. The CBC story that I watched on the TV the other night also mentioned that, against that backdrop, that there had been a 50% diversion from the illegal market to the legal market in Colorado. I will add to that Michael Hartman, Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Revenue, said in the HESA committee that more than 70% of the market in Colorado is now regulated, and that number in Washington is between 50 and 65% now in the regulated market. So where we saw the dramatic footage in the CBC story, it was obviously about that 50%, what's happening in that 50% of the market in Colorado that is still operating illegally.
No, I think that's that isn't, it's a statement. I do have one other person down here, Senator St. Germain. I can take her for just a single question, and then I'll call the adjournment.
Only because Senator St. Germain.
Thank you so much, Senator Platt, and as well, Mr. Chair. Bonjour et merci de vos réponses.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your answers. My question follows in Senator Eggleton's. For possession of 30 grams for adults, and for young people, it's 5 grams. The Standing Committee on Legal Affairs indicated that since the provinces, and you made reference to this as well, the provinces have all considered that simple possession would be prohibited for young people. So since you want to decriminalize and also respect the youth criminal justice system, why, rather than 5 grams, is it not 0?
I just looked to justice officials to see if they wanted to respond, but I'm quite prepared to respond to that. The discussion that took place with justice on the establishment of a 5-gram maximum was in reflecting a concern about young people being in possession of this drug in some circumstances that could be a higher risk. And so the concern was, if a young person is in possession and brings it to school, for example, or into a social setting with a lot of other young people, that there was a higher risk. And so there was concern about applying some reasonable limit on how much a young person could have within the cannabis Act itself. And so the discussion of what was the appropriate place to set that, a discussion around 5 grams came up. But I think it was very important as well, and I'd reference I'd point out the reference to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, because in establishing the 5 grams, we also wanted to make sure that it was very clear to any law enforcement or prosecutor or judge that the principles of the Youth Criminal Justice Act must apply to any consideration of the prosecution of the possession of in that amount for a young person. And finally, it was also based on a clear understanding. I met with all the provinces and territories. We spoke to them about the importance of using their appropriate jurisdictional authority to enforce the prohibition. And they all get it. It's their experience with alcohol too. It's their experience with tobacco. And so in every place in this country, it's an offense for a young person to possess alcohol. It's not a crime under the criminal law. It's an offense under the provincial jurisdiction and provincial regulation. Each province has its own regulation prohibiting possession of, purchase and consumption of alcohol, and its own offense ticket, provincial offense ticket regime, so that the police may enforce it. There was a concern that, unlike alcohol, we wanted to ensure that young people are not engaged in the distribution of cannabis, and so a reasonable limit was placed upon it. And I believe that's where the discussion around the 5 grams, and Carol, if you'd like to fill in that, please.
I think I would just add that the distinction between 30 grams for adults and 5 grams for young persons, 30 grams is quite a bit of dried cannabis. So the estimate would be 40 to 50 joints would constitute 30 grams. The reality is today, in a completely prohibited, criminalized regime, youth still have access to cannabis. So going forward, Bill C-45 recognizes that in a legalized and regulated environment, despite the fact that Bill C-45 prohibits selling, giving, distributing to youth in any circumstance by anyone, recognizes that the reality is a young person may still come into access with a small amount of cannabis. And that's why Bill C-45 proposes to not criminalize 5 grams below, but to leave it to provincial jurisdictions to address it, as the parliamentary secretary has just noted.
Okay, so we've come to the end of this portion of our meeting. Now, originally we were going to have a half-hour break, but that would mean we won't be starting our clause by clause till 20 after. So I'll give you 3 choices. 10 minutes would get us virtually on time. 20 minutes would give you a little bit more, or 30 minutes. What do you want? 15. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I hear 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. We'll pause. We'll pause for 10 minutes.